Right. Hello, everyone. This is the second video of Chapter 6, lecture about leisure's anthropology, and we will start to talk about cultural changes in this video. So really, coming from the previous video about different characteristics of culture, the fifth characteristic is that culture is dynamic, right? It doesn't stay the same, it changes. Often it's gradually. Right? Even you wouldn't even notice if you're living it in your daily life. However, it sometimes changes very dramatically. For example, recently, COVID-19 made a major difference in our life, and it changed our culture to an extent as well. Now, in terms of culture changes, we're going to talk about, textbook is going to talk about four main ways through which culture can change, and they are innovation, diffusion, cultural loss, and acculturation. We'll talk about each of them, and we'll talk about how each relates to leisure. First, innovation. It's an introduction of a new practice, new tool, or new principle that gains a widespread acceptance very rapidly. For example, your textbook uses a TV as an example. That's old-fashioned a little bit, isn't it? But, history there's something we can learn from history always. Between 1950 and 1955, it's just a little over 5 years, TV ownership among US Americans grew from 9% to 65%. That's a big jump. And right now, in the United States, and I expect the same thing, pretty much same thing here in Canada, but 98 or 99 point something percent, of the households have a TV. Not to mention, many households have multiple TVs, like the one in the living room, another one in their bedroom, which isn't necessarily a good thing for couples, apparently. But my question to you is, has there been any cultural innovation since TV? Because that's old news. Maybe that's for your parents. That's even for maybe your grandma. Okay. Was there anything since then? Wi-Fi, internet, or smartphone maybe? Smartphone could be a good example, right? How did it change your life, our leisure life? Well, I can tell you my example, for example, because I was a late adopter of smartphone. Like I got my first smartphone like 2018. Yeah, right? And before that, I was using this free, stupid phone, what I call a stupid phone. And it didn't even let me check my email. Or anything like Facebook or Twitter or YouTube for that matter at all. So that was good because when I'm outside, I wouldn't be able to do any of those things. Now I have a smartphone, and it lets me do a lot of things. And for example, my wife doesn't like it sometimes. I started to play some games, right? I enjoy game, and I played what is called Candy Crush Saga. Yeah. I was like at the level 3,000 or 4,000, something like that. So I was, okay. And I spent a fair amount of time. So my wife is like, well, Shin, you cannot play that anymore. So I stopped playing. And so, it impacts our leisure life, right? And maybe it's considered to be innovation because, again, pretty much everybody now, especially younger generation, do have smartphone now. How do you think? The second way culture can change is the diffusion. It's a spread or borrowing of customs or practices from one culture to another. And the textbook uses example of McDonald's. I can share some example of Japanese McDonald's. The left side is shrimp burger. Yes, it's a shrimp and a couple other things kind of meshed together, and they're deep fried and with some sort of like little vinegary sauce. It's pretty good. It's okay. But my favorite would be the right side, the teriyaki burger. Again, I don't think any other McDonald's outside of Japan have it. But it's basically pork patty poke. Yeah, it's poke. So if you're coming from certain cultures, you don't eat poke, sorry. But then it's juicy poke with this teriyaki sauce, which is like a little salty and sweet. Meets this Japanese mayonnaise, which is vinegary. Yes, Japanese mayonnaise is very different from North American mayonnaise, which I don't consider as a mayonnaise, sorry. They work so well. So if you've ever been to Japan and you're, let's say you're sick of sushi, then here you go. You can try some McDonald's. But again, yes, it spread out from, I think the original shop is in Illinois, somewhere in Illinois, state of Illinois in the United States. And now it's over hundreds of countries across society. Another more sports leisure recreation type of example would be, for example, baseball. Baseball spread to different culture. Well, for Japanese, and it's actually, baseball now in Japan is one of the most popular sports. But it was introduced originally by US American, a professor of English actually, right after, no, even right before World War I, yes. And before World War II, we had their first professional team. And we had a very interesting period of time during World War II because we couldn't use English, yes, those time, right? So we had to play baseball with the Japanese, which was very awkward apparently. But then from there, the number of the team increased. They get really popular. There's a TV. People go to stadium. Then, as maybe some of you know, we have produced one of the best players in the world. Ichiro Suzuki may come to your mind, and we have won some World Baseball Classic, which is like World Championship. We have more younger generation going into the Major League Baseball as well. And it's, we do good in the baseball, I guess. But again, originally it was borrowed. It was given from different culture, basically. So now this is Japanese example. But what about your culture? If you're from Canada, what's the thing, and especially leisure-related thing, that Canada borrowed from different cultures? If you're from China, maybe you're from Nigeria. If you're from maybe Iran, what is the thing that your culture borrowed from other cultures? The third mechanism through which culture changes is cultural loss, sorry. Basically, you're losing. The culture loses something, the tradition. And here example is what I'm mentioning is an indigenous culture in Canada as well as the other world. And I don't mean that their indigenous cultures are lost. No, they're still there, lived by many people. But they were historically, if you take a look at the history, they were seriously threatened by mostly Western European cultures and people. There's that history. And well, but there's actually a couple, exception to that too. For example, well, Brazil has actually a very big indigenous population. Well, there are some Western settlers down there, but Japan actually do have indigenous people in the northern part of Japan, and sadly, their culture was also very much endangered by the dominant Japanese people as well. Anyway, but then, as you can see now, probably their indigenous cultures have been rediscovered, reclaimed, and sustained to an extent by many organizations and laws and policies and people really. And one of the example is this something called World Indigenous Nations Games, called WIN Games, right? It's like a national, it's like Olympic in a way. It goes around the countries, cities. And I think it's every year, but it could be every other year, sorry. But 2017 WIN Games were held in Edmonton here. And it features so many different quote-unquote, sports leisure type of activity. But in many indigenous cultures, this, for example, sports leisure and the rest of this, life, such as work, family, other things, they're not necessarily, clearly divided. They're more, intertwined, if you will. Okay, so a lot of leisure, recreation, sports, games are very practical as well. For example, bow and arrow, which can be good for hunting, right? Log race, like literally you with a certain number of people, you carry a log and you run a certain distance. Tug of strength, there's a rope and two teams from both sides kind of pull it. And also, you can see the practical value to it. You can use those things, for example, in hunting or agriculture, many other things as well. But really, they feature traditional skills, right? Experiences, relationships, power, sheer power. It's pretty exciting games as well. The force change through which culture can, force mechanism through which culture can change is acculturation. And here, the key is that when acculturation happens, two cultures or two or more meet, okay? And there's a change in one or both cultures, usually both to an extent. And there's this Barry, he's a researcher. I think he was working at a UBC, University of British Columbia, I think. But he's well known for acculturation research, and he identifies 4 possible outcomes, so results of acculturation after acculturation happened. And it's very important. They're very important. I want you to remember that too. So therefore, assimilation, integration, marginalization, and separation is not rejection like your textbook said. They got it wrong. Separation. And if you list this way, in this order, it's if you take the first character, it's aims. So maybe it's easier to remember. It's up to you. But textbook tried to explain them by word, by writing, which was good but difficult. So I'm going to use a model, like a visual. Okay, actually, it's Barry's acculturation model. And in this model, there are 2 key questions. Right, and the assumption here is that there are 2 cultures meeting. One of them is more dominant and more majority, mainstream than the other. For example, let's take me as an example. I'm a Japanese person, or maybe, coming into Canada, so maybe I'm not Japanese Canadian, but I'm kind of belonging to this Japanese/Japanese Canadian community, maybe in Canada. So Japanese culture is the non-dominant culture, and I'm living in this dominant Canadian culture, right? Now, does non-dominant culture, like Japanese here in Canada, want to maintain its values, traditions, and identity? Do I want to be like Japanese here in Canada? The second question, left side, is does non-dominant culture want a relationship, connect with the dominant, in this case, Canadian culture? So yes or no, 2 by 2, right? If the answer to these questions are both yes, I want to keep my Japanese identity and cultures, traditions, but also I want to relate to dominant Canadian culture, then that's integration. Basically, you're bringing a 2 culture. Most likely, it's it's a nice balance between the 2. If you say, yes, I want to relate to the dominant Canadian culture, but I don't care about my Japanese side, so I'm going to just let it go. Now, I will probably disappear into the mainstream Canadian culture. I will start to talk like Canadian, wear like a Canadian, do leisure like a Canadian. And that's what's called assimilation. Okay. Opposite to that is basically I want to keep my Japanese-ness, if you will, right? But I don't want to relate, and I don't want to relate to the dominant Canadian culture. And I'll be very, in a way, isolated and very distinctive because I behave very differently. That's separation, not rejection. And finally, marginalization is no and no. No, I don't want to relate to the dominant Canadian culture. No, I don't want to keep my Japanese tradition heritage. That's very rare though, but it's considered to be one of the worst scenarios. So what are the leisure example of these acculturation outcomes, right? Because we're talking about leisure. Maybe in the case of integration, Hockey Night Canada in Punjabi that we just saw, there was a video if you want to take. Now take a look. That's a great example of integration, because Hockey Night Canada, the TV show, the ice hockey, you know, NHL, well, not so much NHL, but hockey, ice hockey, it's very Canadian culture, if you will. And there's a Punjabi language, the culture that are added to it. It's a balance, the mixture of the two. So integration, you're relating to the dominant culture, but also keeping your background heritage, Punjabi. What about marginalization? It's a really tricky one, this one though. So I'm gonna give you my hypothetical example. If I wouldn't attend, for example, Japanese community events, I don't really care about my Japanese side, but I don't really want to make Canadian friends as well, then you are culturally uprooted. You don't have the anchor. You don't have a foundation, cultural foundation. This is very vulnerable. You're more likely to be vulnerable to depression, what is called acculturation, stress, social isolation, many risk factors. I left intentionally those assimilation and separation part. So your job is to identify your example, major example. Research suggests that integration, the top one, the yes combination, is positively related to well-being, you know, happiness, if you will. That's important for our course. While marginalization is tied to acculturation, stress, really basically anything that's not good for people who are moving to different cultures. Okay, I'm gonna stop my second video here, and I will see you in the third video.